React server components aren't server components. React client components aren't client components. Hi, I'm Tchofo Safo, a React developer and full-stack evangelist. In other words, as the name suggests, I'm here to preach the gospel of full-stack coding in React 19. Luther, gospel, preaching, you know about it. So, over the past months to more than a year, I've been experimenting with React server components, as well as React 19, Next.js 15, and now React Router v7. What I present to you this evening is the beginning of my findings. Here's the plan. First, we'll explore the reasons why RSCs, React Server Components, and RCCs, React Client Components, are not what they seem. Second, we'll reveal what makes some of these RSCs and RCCs agnostic components. Third, we'll explore a new way to organize code with these agnostic components in the Next.js 15 code base. And finally, before wrapping up, we'll look at how agnostic components are relevant in the Remix world through a snippet of Ryan Florence's talk from last year's ReactConf on bringing RSCs to React Router v7. So in order to present my findings, I will use the following files. Here we have a component that fetches on the server, so that's a server component. Here we have a component that's a pass-through component, so it has no server-side logic and no client-side logic. Here we have some buttons who act on the client and were exported from a file with use client. And here we have some components like dead card that have no client-side logic and no server-side logic that are exported with no directive. So, are React server components really server components? For example, in the current full-stack React architecture, the absence of a directive makes components server by default. So why is it that on one end we have a component that does render on the server, as ascertained by the React developer tools, but on the other end we have a component under the same configuration that does not render on the server? Let me show you. So we have page that has no directive, and date card that has no directive, and an index that also has no directive. But if I go on the page, I can see that moments page is marked as server, while date card is not. Even though, once again, both have no directive, and theoretically, files without directives are server by default. This is due to the fact that despite both components being configured for the same without a directive, one component possesses and executes server-side logic, while the other does not. This allows us to make a clear distinction between two kinds of React server components, if we consider React server components based on their lack of a directive. On one end, the RSCs that cannot run on the client are true server components, for they can only run on the server. On the other end, the RSCs that can execute on the client, despite not being targeted for the client, are effectively agnostic server components. Let me show you again. So this time, I'm going to look at page and core. What I will do is that I will try to force them to become client components. So here, if I turn this client, let me see, up, refresh this one. Yes, the page throws an error because I'm trying to do server logic inside the client component. So I'm going to bring it back to server. However, if here I change this to client, nothing happens because this component, which was theoretically server, has no server-side logic to call its own. So basically, that's why the first one is a true server component, while the other one is an agnostic server component. This is why so many times what at first seemed like a server component ends up on the client as if it never were a server component in the first place. The same is true for React client components, here understood as components exported from or through files marked with the use client directive. If a React client component processes and executes client-side logic, it cannot run on the server, only on the client, which makes it a true client component. However, if it doesn't have any client-side logic and can therefore run just as well on the server as it does on the client, then it is actually an agnostic client component. Let me show you again. This time I will look at the client components that are here and the components here that have no directive. And so I will force these components which don't have any client-side logic to become client. Naturally, nothing happens because they don't have any client-side logic. So I begin back to no client. But if I decide to turn this client component into no client component, then I have an error because I'm trying to use client-side logic into a file that is not mapped with client. And so that's why I consider that these are actually true client components, while the other ones are agnostic client components. So here's the review. React server components are not server components. They're either true server components or agnostic server components. React client components are not client components. They're either true client components or agnostic client components. In reality, true server components are server components. True client components are client components. And effectively, as well as ultimately, agnostic server components and agnostic client components are one and the same. They are agnostic components. Components that are neither exclusively server nor exclusively client, but adhere to their rendering environment. If they're imported on the server, they'll turn into server components. If they're imported on the client, they'll turn into client components. And that's exactly what agnostic server components and agnostic client components are and do. Within the paradigm of the full-stack React architecture, agnostic components are React server components exported from modules without directive that can be imported into the client tree. This enforces that they come from modules without server-side logic, and therefore come without server-side logic themselves. This category also applies to all React client components exported from modules devoid of client-side logic that are mapped with the use client directive, making these RCCs come without client-side logic themselves. React recognizes that their lack of client-side directive, their lack of client logic makes them exempt from adoration and can therefore import these components safely into the server tree. In simpler terms, an agnostic component is a component without server-side or client-side logic. Its logic, truth be told, is agnostic. It isn't bound to any explicit runtime, neither server nor client. It can therefore be imported freely across the server and the client. In even simpler terms, agnostic components are the React server components that aren't server components, and the React client components that aren't client components. With this, we can differentiate and establish the existence of three primary React components. Server components which only run server-side and remain close to the source on the server tree. Client components which only run client-side and force through props their child components to be rendered on the client tree. Through props here is very important because it explains why some client components like suspense, error boundaries, and context providers, as long as they don't pass down props, can be parent to server components without preventing them from rendering on the server. And finally, we have agnostic components which run on both the server and the client, depending on whether they're imported in the server tree or the client tree. And that's how you can clearly make the difference between a React server component, which may actually be agnostic, and an actual server component which in no way can run on the client. In order for agnostic components to be properly imported as such, they need to live in a space of their own, free from server-side or client-side logic, the agnostic module. In fact, as we've seen in the previous examples, the agnostic module is already there. It has simply fallen by the wayside. For example, it is by acknowledging that a module is effectively agnostic that React can safely import a component from a module without a directive into a module marked with the use client directive. This is why it is my belief that a use agnostic directive is not only needed to ensure that a module is strictly agnostic, it is also a solution that can already be used today to better organize and better understand existing code bases. For example, here I now know that this is actually a server component, so I don't need to change it. But I also know that this module exports an agnostic component. Therefore, I can just write here, use agnostic, even though it doesn't do anything for now. Here is client, so I don't touch it. But here, since I know that these components are actually agnostic, I can write here again, use agnostic. In my code on the browser, nothing changes. But within my code, I can now see clearly that this has no directive, so it's server. This I use agnostic, so it's agnostic. And this I use client, so it's client. And to further my point, let's look at how Ryan Florence of the Remix team introduced RSCs for React Router v7.
I've got my loader, and you might decide one day, like, you know what, this bit of UI, this list of products there, these top products, we want to move that rendering to the server with RSC. So how do you move rendering to the server in React Router v7? Well, you select your code that you want to move to the server, and then you move it to the server. And then you come down here and you look at this product thing, and you're like, what is that? Well, I guess it's some stuff that I can render. Oh, yep, like I told you, I'm running on an experimental React router and a beta of React, so I got to restart this thing. Oh my goodness, look at this.
So what Ryan just moved from the client to the server is effectively an agnostic component. If it had any client-side logic, like a use state or stateful data, it could not have run on the server. And if it directly includes the server-side API call from the loader, then it could not have run on the client in the first place. Now imagine if, at that time, a use agnostic directive was a real feature. Ryan could have made the component in a verified agnostic module that would guarantee its crossover compatibility between the server and the client. That guarantee will remain even if the agnostic component includes a client component. And eventually, even if in some way the agnostic component includes an actual server component. To conclude, in light of what we've seen, here is what I would propose for the Fullstack React Architecture in React 20. First, server modules which are not marked by any directive should behave as advertised and export server components which only run on the server as long as they export JS6. If these modules don't export JS6, they should morph into the module type of what they're exporting, with developers being responsible for not mixing server-side server and client-side code in the same file. Second, client modules which are marked by the use client directive should also behave as advertised and export client component, which only run on the server. In both cases, the behavior of the server-only and client-only NPM packages should be integrated within server modules and client modules respectively. Third, agnostic modules, whom I propose to be marked by the use agnostic directive, should be the only modules exporting agnostic components which work on the server tree and the client tree. And finally, server functions modules, which are currently marked by the use server directive, should exclusively export server functions, which are server-side functions callable from the client, and the only non-functions through serialization that are able to cross the server-client boundary. So here is what's brand new this evening: agnostic components, agnostic modules, and I use agnostic directive. But in reality, none of these were actually brand new. Agnostic components and agnostic modules were there the whole time, either between React server components and React client components. And the use agnostic directive at this time is simply a placebo to make it all make sense. So I'll leave with a teaser of what I've been imagining, and a final meme that perfectly summarizes what I've been saying this whole time.
All lies will be exposed. That's all.
That's all. Merci. Yeah, sure.
So this is something you're working on?
Yeah, yeah. Because basically my idea is that when I present something like agnostic components, I need to have the idea of what's coming next, so that this idea can seamlessly integrate to the next one. What?
Yeah, still struggle to comprehend what RSCs are.
Okay.
So when you use like React Browser 7 with the latest features, what RSCs bring into the table?
Okay.
Performance
Let me
improvement?
show you the actual image. So for now RSCs are not yet implemented in React v 7, but this is how Ryan Florence was showing that that the team would do it. And so the idea that the team has is that you will be able to take your code from the client because and bring it to the server, because the idea is that the loader, which is right here, loader still here, runs on the server, but the default function runs on the client. And so you would effectively take your code and run it on the server and just return the actual output on the client. So because here you see that products the return from the loader here is JSX. It's code for the client, and then it gets that return from the user data here, and it puts it in the client here through products here. So the idea that he has is that you would be able to take code from the client and put it in the server. But the thing is that even though it says that these are RSCs, this component doesn't fetch data. What fetches data is the loader itself. And so that's why I say that this is actually not a real server component. It's actually
static. When it arrives on the client side, it's static.
Exactly.
It's no longer any interaction. It's no longer virtual load.
Yeah, indeed. And also the thing is that, well, it showed in the video, but actually it also included a client component in what is returning. So the idea is that when you would return a component from the server, it will leave a hole that will be running on the client, but not on the server for client components. And so that's why this is why the use client directive is useful, because it tells React that this code should not run on the server.
Yeah, so it is faster or less JS on the client or something?
The idea, well, let me show you. The idea of the original reveal of server components was to create 0 bundle size React server components. So the idea was to so that you no longer have JS on the client; it all runs on the server, and the only thing that remains is just the JSX. I would say just the HTML. And that gives me the opportunity to show something, which is that when I mentioned agnostic components, actually this is an idea that the React team had from the very beginning. Because if you see the RFC, they mention shared components and shared hooks. They mention shared modules. And they mention here that everything is implicitly shared until proven otherwise. So what I'm showing is actually not new. Like it was part of the bedrock of the RSC model. But for some reason, over the time, it disappears for a new model that is more complicated. I really think that the React team should come back to its roots and just re-explore what I call agnostic modules and agnostic components. Yeah.
In the famous case of XKCD, we have 15 Hi. Thank you for the talk. In the famous case of XKCD, we have 15 competing senders. Let's make another one that will unify all of them. And now we have 16. Because at the beginning, React Server components are the default one, and the ones that are interactive are the client components. And if you introduce something like agnostic components, you will, like in the server component, you have to check if you have something like client hooks. In the client component today, in the client component, you have to check if you have DB calls or server calls, something like that. In the agnostic components, you will have to check if you have either one, both of these things.
You will have to check that you have neither of these.
Neither of those, and you can already do that with only server components and client components.
Well, the idea, what I'm saying is that, in fact, like if you see my code, I'm doing it right now. Like I know that this is agnostic, and I know that this is agnostic. So technically, it already works right now without needing to call it agnostic. But the idea is that if you don't really understand that some code, that some server code is really server and others are actually agnostic, you encounter issues like the one that I was showing, where you believe that that date card is server, but it's not. So my idea is that you kind of really have to have a declarative way to understand that your code is not server, even though you think it is. That's what I'm calling for, pretty much.
Yeah, but we don't care. It's server by default.
That's not true, because when I say that it's server by default, it's not really server by default, because again, this one is really server by default because it does actually run do server logic. But let's say I remove the directive here. No, not this one. Yeah, this one. So I would argue that this one is server by default, right? So since there's no directive. But if you look at the code of the component, it doesn't do anything server. Like there's nothing server in what it's doing. So it can actually run on a client. And that actually what happens with my data component here.
Yes, but why would you want to run it on the client? Because you could optimistically bundle it on the server and serve it already cached on the client. And if you don't want it, if you really want it to be run on the client, you use client, and it will. Yes, but maybe we could talk about.
J'en mets temps ou pas? J'ai 2 minutes pour finir.
It's a great discussion.
It may be a great discussion after. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Thanks very much.
Merci.
So,